And welcome to Forum 360. I'm your host, Bill Saus, and you're watching and listening to Forum 360, a global outlook program with a local view. We're on Western Reserve Public Media, the Fusion channels, 4549. We're on Hudson Community TV, our host studio, and you're heard on Rubber City radio stations. Forum 360 is glad today to have a Northern Ohio author and publisher, as well as a businessman. He's been an executive with some Fortune 500 companies. He is a resident of Worcester, Ohio, Robert Adamov, but he goes by Bob Adamov. Bob, good to have you on Forum 360.
It's a blast to be here. Based on what we were talking about beforehand, I'm looking forward to this. It'll be a lot of fun.
Excellent. And Bob has written how many novels now?
I've got 12 out. I'm working on number 13 and 14.
And one of the most prolific writers, Kent State University graduate, grew up and graduated from Norton High School. And Bob is now an award-winning Ohio author. Bob, a little bit about your background, how you got involved in writing and choosing that as a part of an avocation and a career now.
Okay. Well, I've always wanted to write since I was 8 years old, and turning 50 didn't bother me, but 51 hit me like a ton of bricks. And I thought, I'm going to go ahead and write my first novel and just see what happens. And so I like Civil War, and I like Putin Bay. And when I first went out to Putin Bay when I was 18, we came around Gibraltar Island, and I saw Putin Bay, and I thought, what a great location to have a story set. So when I did Rainbow's End and launched it October 12th of 2002, the beginning of the book was Civil War, Johnson's Island, and then jumped up to a modern adventure set in Putin Bay.
That was your first one, and I know that whenever I travel, I go to some of the hotels, motels, resorts up along the Lake Erie coast between Toledo and Cleveland, and I see a lot of your books on sale. So I know not only the residents are excited, but the travelers as they visit, go to Cedar Point, go to Sawmill Creek, these kind of places, and of course the islands.
Right.
So Bob, you're an award-winning Ohio mystery writer, and that we call Putin Bay at this point now the Key West of the Midwest.
That's right.
And so it's amazing, your most recent novel, Flight, Putin Bay to Key West and Cuba.
Right.
A little bit about your protagonist. He's an investigative reporter.
Right, and part of the reason I chose an investigative reporter, part of it goes back to the Akron Beacon Journal. When I was in 6th grade, I read a story about an investigative reporter going undercover as a hobo, and then wrote stories about living like a hobo. I like that. But the real driver on it was Watergate. When you think back to Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, what they did at the Washington Post.
Right.
And my investigative reporter works out of the Washington Post.
And it's interesting, he has family on South Pass Island, and in the most recent book, you talk about his aunt, who on the East Point part of South Bass, his aunt kind of has him stay with him, and he travels with folks from the Putin Bay area. So give us a little bit more information about your writing style, and you have a famous author that you've communicated with. Many people might have read his books, Clive Cussler and his son, but Clive Cussler, older author, but he's written a multitude of books about the sea, about exploration, and so forth.
Clive and I have become friends. Clive, the first book of mine that he read was Promised Land. And it was kind of funny because Clive sent me a note and he commented, there's a picture of my street rod. It's a 1939 Packard. And Clive says, I love the car. I have 2 of my own. And I've actually went out, met Clive, got a tour of his car collection, and I've spoken at 4 of their collectors' conventions. And they've been a blast. Hung out with his co-writers. Clive and Dirk are absolutely down-to-earth, first-class guys. It's just a joy to be with them. And my style, I try to emulate Clive. So Rainbow's End again, it started off with Civil War
Right.
and then jumps up to modern times with a link back to what happened in the Civil War.
And that's how Clive Cussler, I've read some of his novels where he'd take a historical figure, someone in the past, and he'll talk about exploring where they passed, where they died, where their ship went down. And those are amazing stories. You go back and forth, by the way, like you said, between, in your first novel, Civil War, 1860s to the modern day. And in this book, the new book, Flight, you go from the late 1920s to the current events.
Right. We start this one off in 1928 when the second worst hurricane hit Florida. And we end up with Pinkerton in a Ford Tri-Motor chasing a treasure train on its way to Key West. Neither one make their destination. So that's the premise in the beginning of the book.
And there's a connection, the Flagler family, which originally the Flagler multimillionaires were from Ohio. And of course, if you travel down the east coast of Florida, the Flaglers had tremendous amount of influence and in industry as well as in the railroads there.
Right. Flagler got his start in Bellevue, Ohio, and where he linked up with Rockefeller and then helped create Standard Oil. And in Bellevue, Ohio, there's actually a train museum that's really cool to go visit.
Another author, very famous American author, spent a lot of time in Key West and wrote many books like Islands in the Stream. One of his latter books was Ernest Hemingway. So in a way, you're kind of bringing back that same spirit that Hemingway started, couldn't finish because of his age and so forth, and his premature death. But you bring a lot of, to me, Hemingway, reminiscent of Hemingway.
No, thank you. And I look for any opportunity I can to get to Key West to write something about Key West.
And as a matter of fact, you were a featured author at the 2006 Ernest Hemingway Festival, the literary festival in Key West, and you were named Writer of the Year by University of Akron's Wayne College in 2010. And you were presented, like you mentioned earlier, with the Clive Cussler Collectors Society awards and conventions. And let's talk a little bit about your selection and your name for Emerson Moore. We think of some of the great mystery writers and thriller writers. We, of course, know James Bond from Ian Fleming. And this gentleman, Emerson Moore, he might not have as much training in special forces and military, although he has friends that have been involved in that. But being a journalist, how do you think he deals with some of these really stressful issues as a journalist?
Well, we toughened him up, but we really wanted Emerson to be a guy that people could relate to. He's just an everyday guy, makes mistakes just like all of us make. You know, and the other side of hell, he goes diving with the villain. Two go down, one comes up. You know, he knows it's a bad guy. I've had readers come up to me and tell me, we would love to meet Emerson and just sit down with him and have a beer. The Emerson Moore name came from John Emerson, who was my first boss at Goodyear. The Moore came from my buddy Jack Moore, who used to participate in skits with me, and if I needed a fall guy, he would always do that for me.
And you incorporate these real people into your novels. Have people kind of question, are you going to talk about me this time, Bob? Or some people might be a little more reticent, and well, I'll change the name if you'd like. But you know, how do you come up? Do you approach them, say, I might use you? I might ask you a couple of questions about your career or something.
I love to surprise people and use their names in the book and just catch them off guard. Now, I have a lot of people come up to me and say, well, would you use my name in one of the future books? So I'll make a note and I try to incorporate them in for a character, and usually I try to make sure I don't make them into a villain. I want them to be a good guy.
Now, we're going to ask you to go through your novels, just a minute on each one, and in chronological order, I suppose, and then we're going to take a break and we'll finish up with further questioning.
Okay. Well, I mentioned Rainbow's End. Percival is a corporate takeover battle book that goes from Putin Bay, Northeast Ohio to Wall Street, loosely based on what happened to me at Goodyear during the Goldsmith takeover attempt and at Caliber System in 1996. When Rainbow's Walk goes from Putin Bay down to Key West with a heist of Mel Fisher's treasure during the eye of Hurricane Charlie. Promised Land is Da Vinci Code meets Hurricane Katrina. The Other Side of Hell goes from Putin Bay down to Key West and then to the Cayman Islands, drug running, sunken treasure. 10 lines is bioterrorism on Lake Erie. The president disappears when he visits Putin Bay.
Got the White House on the cover.
Yes, I do. Sandusky is a cross between Da Vinci Code and National Treasure, a worldwide chase to find the clues to the puzzle. Zenobia deals with human trafficking from Putin Bay, Toledo, down to Naples, Florida. Missing, our hero's memory goes missing. He thinks he's a hitman for the mob, starts pulling off hits in Cleveland and Detroit.
The investigative reporter, Emerson.
Yes,
Right.
yes. And he gets toughened up in this one with some training down in Florida. This one, Golden Torpedo, deals with the death of Franklin Roosevelt in Warm Springs, Georgia. Did he die of a cerebral hemorrhage or was he assassinated? And there were a lot of rumors going around that he was assassinated. Chincoteague Calm. This one deals with the east coast of Virginia.
Right.
Across from Chincoteague Island, where they swim the ponies every July, is Wallops Island. I went down there for a visit. When I heard they had a problem with NASA rockets exploding, I thought, gee, sabotage, you know, there could be a story here. So we devised that story. And then Flight, we briefly talked about starting in, with the Pinkertons in 1928. And then ending up with Emerson going undercover in Key West, working at Booger Blake's bar on Whitehead Street, and then going on over to Cuba. It's his most dangerous adventure of all.
We of course remember Sloppy Joe's bar, where Hemingway was active. And now, this is basically a prequel. And so, briefly, where do you go from here? Because if you finish this, I read ahead, and it is amazing that our protagonist, our Washington Post columnist, reporter, got away with his life, and thank God. But what is the next step then?
So the next one, the sequel to that one is called Assateague Dark, and it deals with drug running on the Delmarva Peninsula on the east coast of Virginia. I'm about halfway done with it. It'll be out next May.
So we're going back to Virginia.
Yes.
It's amazing that we travel all over. And of course, the Washington Post, mostly the East Coast, his beat, I guess you could say. And we are going to just briefly take a break and advise everyone that this is Forum 360, a program with a global outlook, a local view. We are on Western Reserve Public Media, channels 4549, the Fusion channel. We are on Hudson Community TV, in our host studio here in Hudson. And we are heard on Rubber City radio stations, WAKR and WONE-FM. And we have this global outlook with today's guest, Bob Adamov, because so far he's taken us to many places outside of the United States, outside of Ohio, especially this new one, Cuba. Now that's an interesting venue, Cuba. We, again, would like to talk about Clive Cussler and the Great Lakes connection. So you kind of like Clive Cussler of the Great Lakes. Clive Cussler goes with his son Dirk. They work, matter of fact, they have this one protagonist that's kind of a pirate. I love that kind of, he's really a positive, almost like a Robin Hood. So how are you moving the Great Lakes into, you know, usually people say, the Great Lakes, just the Midwest bodies of water. But tell me how interesting the Great Lakes have been to you.
Oh, I think very interesting. It's been a great place. Going up to the Lake Erie Islands, then I've gone over to Grosse Ile. And actually, Grosse Ile is where President Bush learned how to fly and land his plane.
In Michigan, then.
Yes. And so I spent time up there. And then there's a place off of Upper Michigan Peninsula I want to go to, and you know, I just went
like
blank
Traverse City in that area.
Yeah, and there's an island up there that's very interesting to me. I'd like to go make a research trip up there and check it out, see if it might fit into a plot. Just like when I went to Chincoteague, I had no idea. I ended up going to Chincoteague, and the island spoke to me as soon as I hit the ground, and I said, this is a place that I want to visit and do a story about.
Is Ontario and Canada part of it, international look right now?
No, I haven't used Ontario in any of the books. Primarily Lake Erie. I've looked at Lake Michigan and maybe bringing Chicago in. But you know, in one of the books in Sandusky, we're in Egypt and Bodrum, Turkey. I mean, we're all around. So my books aren't limited to the Great Lakes. And I've done book signings, Vegas, LA, Tacoma, of course, Florida. I'm all over Florida. I have a huge following in Southwest Florida.
Let me ask you a little bit about how you, for instance, picked the Pinkerton Detectives, the Pinkerton Security and Investigations. How did you pick that group of all the law enforcement or to begin this novel, Flight?
Well, I knew I needed someone in law enforcement for the beginning of that story, because we had this load of treasure being put on this armored car. And I didn't want to use local police or sheriff or state troopers or whatever. And I felt a private security force would be appropriate, because how it evolves into the plot of the story, it was more doable and workable for me. So Pinkerton was the one that I'm most familiar with and chose them.
And I recall that actually when Pinkerton started in the 1800s, Illinois Central was one of their first accounts, and many railroads were their accounts back during the days of Lincoln. So that was a beautiful one. And of course the tri-motor, Ford tri-motor, which for years flew in and out of Putin Bay.
Right.
That was a great selection. And the way you tied it in with the various storms. Now you talked about having hurricanes. Have you, in your past, ever experienced one of those hurricanes when you were traveling?
Missed it by one day.
Wow.
In fact, it delayed my flight to the Cayman Islands, and my friend Mad Dog was already on the island and rode it out. So he had all kinds of stories to tell us, but no, I've come close, but haven't been in one. And I don't want to be in one.
Now, our protagonist again, Emerson Moore, has a friend who often shows up who was military trained. It was a Special Forces Navy SEAL. Talk a little bit about that character.
Yeah, Sam Duncan. He's a little bit on the wild side. You know, again, he does a lot of covert black ops stuff. And people have asked me, they said, Bob, who are you? Are you Emerson Moore or are you Sam Duncan? And I said, well, I'm more Emerson Moore, but I got a prankster side to me that's a little bit of Sam Duncan. Right. But in Flight, we introduce one of the wildest characters I have ever met in my life. His name is Big Daddy Chuck Meyer. He lives down in Cudjoe Key. One day in Tikrit, when he was over there with Blackwater Group, he had 3 IEDs go off underneath him. The third one took his leg off below the knee. He has flaming long red hair, wears a Viking hat with the horns coming out, wears a kilt. He managed a strip club in Key West, and he does a lot of work with law enforcement. But he's a 6'6" mountain of a muscle, man. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And this past year we went down, hung out with him, and Roe Terry, who's in Chincoteague, legendary duck carver from Chincoteague. But we just had a blast. Some of the characters that I get to meet and then incorporate in my novels, it's just so much fun.
Has anyone from Washington Post, any of the editors, called you or made contact as to, how they feel about having their Emerson Moore on their staff?
No, nobody's contacted me.
Fictitious staff.
And and that's kind of interesting too, because in Rainbow's End, that was supposed to be the only book with Putin Bay. Mm-hmm. He's a Washington Post reporter. He has a houseboat that he lives on the Potomac River.
Right.
And he came to Putin Bay to visit his aunt on East Point. Right. And reader reaction that summer after the book came out was so strong about Putin Bay. I said, gee, he's an investigative reporter. It doesn't matter where he's domiciled. So in book 2, Pierce the Veil, I moved him in with his aunt because she had lost her husband. Right. And he had lost his family, his wife and son, in a tragic accident. And we kind of hint about it throughout the books, and we reveal in Zenobia what really happened to them. So it's kind of fun, but to bring Putin Bay in, again, it wasn't supposed to be in, all the stories are supposed to take place in Washington, D.C.
Right,
but
because that's
we moved there to Putin Bay.
I was just wondering if anyone is interested, may they check the website www.bobadamov.com. And again, it's www.bobadamov, Adamov.com. Also, you have a number 330 area code 289-7616. That's 330-289-7616.
I'm available for speaking engagements for groups, and
Now,
we've had a lot of fun doing that.
Would you also, any reaction from Kent State University? I know you trained there in writing and in business as well, but any reaction from other alum or
Yes,
staff?
they wrote me up a couple of times, and then Kent State, in this corporate takeover battle book, in their business department, they actually do some training of how to trade on the market. And I have them come to the rescue at the end of the book. And part of this book takes place in Cuyahoga Falls.
Very good. How about the publishing side? You delved into publishing as well as being the author. And so obviously you and your family are putting a lot of time in the publishing, the Packard. A little bit about your publishing wing.
Sure. Well, I'm a doer. I'm not a waiter. And so I've talked to other authors, and I hear about all the process of getting literary agents and trying to find a book company to publish you. So I created my own company, and it's Packard Island Publishing, and I front all the money. We print the books, and I have a team of editors, and we have some movie interest that's developed too on the books.
All this coming to Northern Ohio,
Yes.
and it is bringing a focus on our local achievements by our author and guest, Bob Adamov. Again, you're drafting new books right now. You're probably, how far do you plan ahead? And just for some people that are listening and watching at home, what's your routine as an author? Different authors go on PBS. They have the programs where they interview authors, and I think that's one of the typical questions. What's your routine? Do you get up early? How do you get involved in writing?
It used to be I only wrote on weekends, and from 6 a.m. until maybe 9 or 10. Now I write throughout the day as it hits me. And there is a writing season for me, and that's usually July and August. When it's hot out, I love being in the air conditioning and very focused. And I also know I'm on deadline, because if I want a new book to come out April 1st or May 1st of the following year, I need to focus and get that first manuscript done. I've usually been taking notes during the past, prior several months, and then everything comes together, and I still make changes to the plot. Acid Dark, I roughly know how it's going to end, but that final scene I'm not sure what it's going to be yet.
Now, do you have any positive critics, Clive Cussler, or people that you'll send a portion of your transcript or manuscript and you want to have some reaction? Do you have that type of assistance?
I do. So my brother is my most direct critic.
Brother Sam?
Yes.
In
Sam.
Arizona?
Yes.
Okay.
And my wife. So they get first look-see and tell me what's believable and what isn't. Then I have a team of editors, and I have 6 editors that go through the material. I am very, very concerned about how the material appears to the readers. I want it to be accurate. I don't mind stretching a little bit, but you won't see aliens and rocket ships, and Mars trips with me. I'm really more of a mystery adventure writer, and I want it to be down to earth, something that people can relate to easily.
Well, I know Forum 360 is always talking about the economics of our Northern Ohio area, in Northeastern Ohio, Akron, Canton, Youngstown. And this is really a new venture. It's a way of bringing someone from the area, and you were trained in economics, you're trained in finance as an executive with businesses. How do you market these now? Obviously with the internet, but what are ways of marketing your books today?
Well, the best way I do is Facebook. And then I have created a great following, and I do a pre-sale on my Facebook account. And I also tell people where I'm going to be. So last weekend, we did a Coconut Commando party. That's an opportunity for my readers to meet with real characters from my book. And we just have a great time. We meet at a restaurant or bar in Key West or Putin Bay. This last one was at Port Clinton. So we do that. I do a lot of speaking engagements, and then after I speak, a library, a Rotary, or whatever, then I sell my books. It's very aggressive marketing on my part, and I have some marketing in my background which helps me.
Bob Adamov, we've got about a minute left. If you are going to give one of our viewers or one of our listeners a tip as to how to get involved in writing, you've got about 30 seconds, how to emulate some of the things you've been doing, what would you suggest someone do?
I'm asked that question a lot, and I spend a lot of time with budding authors and trying to help them get started. And it comes down to two simple words: do it.
Do it. Okay. You do preparation. You study. You look at various historical events. Civil War at the beginning. Now almost the Roaring '20s in your latest book, and you travel. And if anybody really wants to get a travel log, I'm amazed at the places you write about. Washington D.C. of course, for Emerson more. If you like the James Bond mystery, that style, or Clive Cussler style, I urge our audience to continue to follow up. Thank you, Bob Adamov, for being a part of Forum 360. We hope to see you again and bless you in the future, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate it. Great.
Forum 360 is brought to you by John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Akron Community Foundation, Hudson Community Television, the Rubber City Radio Group, Shaw Jewish Community Center of Akron, Blue Green, Electric Impulse Communications, and Forum 360 supporters.